Welcome to another session of the Learner's Mindset Discussion. I'm Dr. Dwayne Hrapnik,
I'm Dr. Talissa Thibodeau.
and today we're going to be talking about rubrics. But before we do that, just want to qualify a couple of points. We're experimenting with a new piece of software, so in the recording you're going to see a little demo message. We're experimenting, we're trying it out, so we thought we'd test it out in a live setting. The other thing is you're noticing in this session I'm using a headset. Well, my office is in my home, and my home is very busy. It's Monday after a race weekend, and there's going to be people walking around, and so this is the only way I can sort of keep things quiet. So enough of the housekeeping. Let's get going on to rubrics. So why do we need to talk about rubrics? Why? Well, some people would say that they're an extremely important part of the educational assessment system. Some people would argue that they're an educational sacred cow. Some people say, rubrics? What do you use rubrics for? Well, we want to deal with rubrics because rubrics are something that come up in the courses that we teach. Any thoughts before we sort of jump into some of the issues dealing with rubrics, Dr. Thibodeau?
I think this is an important topic because, from my experience as a classroom teacher, a lot of what we did was based on, putting the standards and competencies and curriculum into some form of a rubric so that we could measure progress and student achievement. But I think that we might need to discuss this a bit further. I think that we can do more than just, have rubrics. There's more to this conversation than assigning a standard and competency to a rubric. And a lot of times our students in our program will ask these questions. I think it's good that we consider talking about this and addressing this in a sort of an informal and casual way.
Okay, yeah, I agree. So, on that note, before we get into some of the, people who are not fond of rubrics like Magic Wilson, Alfie Cohn, and so on and so forth, let's just talk about our experience. And I want to share just from very practical experience when I think rubrics really work well and when they might not. And then we can take a look at some of the issues that come about. Um, if you are in an environment where you're sharing information, you're doing content delivery, you're teaching to a standard, you are making sure that students are going to be tested on a standard, and they have to be able to share back, okay, regurgitate back information. Well, then rubrics make a lot of sense. Because if students are going to be expected to give you back the information that you want to see, you got to let them know what you want. And a rubric is one of the best ways to do that. Because if they're really just focusing on that regurgitation of information, rubrics work great because it provides a checklist that the student can go through and they know exactly what to give to the teacher. Right? Or they know exactly what they need to do for the standardized test. We do live in a culture of standardized testing. We are working towards standards. We've got curriculum that has a lot of standards. And so, for the most part, in our educational system, we do have the reality of standards. Rubrics work very, very well in that regard. Any thoughts that you want to add on that?
Yeah, and it leads me to question though, if we're just, asking our learners to, produce for us what it is we want them to know, where is the authentic component to that? How do we actually get our learners to think beyond a rubric or a checklist, and how do I apply what I've learned? And I think that's goes back to that why question too. Like, students don't always understand why they're doing what they're doing, and I think it's because they're missing that authentic application component that a rubric is not going to give you in and of itself. So I'm not saying that it's wrong, but there needs to be something a little bit more to it than that. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. The why component is extremely important. You also mentioned, the students are going to really wonder what it is that they're doing. And in some of the ways that they're being tested from a standards perspective, they really don't need to wonder. It's unfortunately that's the reality. They don't need to wonder. They just need to pass a test, right? So when you're in that type of a scenario where they just need to pass a test, the rubric can work great. But as soon as you start moving into this notion of having the students say, well, excuse me, teacher, why do I need to do this? As soon as you start talking about authentic learning, this is where rubrics no longer really work because authentic learning changes the dynamic. You're moving away from the student giving you back information to the student actually taking ownership of their learning. and they're probably owning the project. They're writing about something, they're creating something, they're building something, they're analyzing something, they're synthesizing something that is unique to them. And a rubric, which really spells out what needs to be delivered in a very neat, systematic, orderly fashion, really can't apply because authentic learning has so many variables and there's so many issues that come into play that you can't systematize and you can't standardize because it would limit the creativity. It would limit the authenticity. So rubrics don't work well with authentic learning. Rubrics don't work well with constructivist-based learning. Rubrics don't work well with projects. And so there's places where they just don't work well. What do you think? Is there anything that I've missed?
I think they could work well if they're not overly prescriptive. If we look at learner outcomes and we look at what we want our learners to really know, and what do our learners want to really know? What's important to them? I'm not saying that, we should make rubrics all based on what's important to the learner, but I definitely think if students were to create rubrics on something that they're actually doing that's authentic to them, if they were to create them themselves, they'd probably emphasize more of the process component of it, which you can't really put a stamp mark on that you have to do it one way and there's the only way to do it. They could probably create a rubric that's, I did it this way. I tried this, it didn't work, and I experimented with this and it did work, and I should have collaborated a little bit more here. Those are things you can't account for in a rubric if it's preset. So that causes me to think our learners need something more than just a checklist, more than just tell me what I need to know. And I face this a lot whenever I teach some of the courses in our program. Just tell me what I need to know, and I can go from there. And actually, what we want you to really think about is doing something that's authentic for you, and something that you can actually impact change, impact your organization, something real. That is where true learning, in my opinion, occurs. Not saying that you don't need to know, the basic facts, multiplication. Yes, you do need to know those things. Those can be things on a rubric, sure. But if you want to authentically apply what you're learning, there's a different route to get there. The path isn't always straight and narrow, you know?
I agree. I actually prefer to use the term a marking guide, right? And the reason that I prefer the term a marking guide is if you're going to have a rubric that is open and flexible. And if you take a look at the rubrics we use within the DLL program, we call them rubrics because our department wants us to call them rubrics. I would prefer to call them marking guides, and I do let our learners know about that. But if you look at our rubrics, one of the big complaints that we get with new students in the program is that, Dr. Harapnik, the rubric is so vague. It's just totally open. It doesn't tell me what I'm supposed to give you. And the reason that it can't is because I'm not the intended audience. Our learners have to recognize that they're building an innovation plan or a project for their audience. And so the rubrics that we use have got 4 sections, and they're very, very vague. We take a look at, is the subject matter, is the idea well addressed? Is there critical and analytical thinking? Have all aspects of the project been addressed? Is it comprehensive? And then the last component usually deals with the presentation. How well has it been presented? So if a person's using a video, the audio is working, is the graphics working? All those things. And so because we're not prescribing what our learners do, they're actually coming up with their own authentic projects. Our rubrics, or as I like to refer to them, are marking guides that give them enough flexibility, but also get them to recognize, well, listen, did you really address that issue of your mindset plan very well? Did you really address, how that mindset would be implemented? Did you make a critical and analytical argument when you presented it? Is your presentation, did that video work? Or, were you moving around on the screen too much? Whatever the case may be. So, we use our marking guides or our rubrics to address those issues, but the student still owns the project. And so there's a bit of a challenge. And so when new students come into the program, it takes them a little while to get used to the fact that, hey, this is your project. It's for your audience. I'm not the intended audience. Your colleagues, other faculty members, your department, your administrator, your principal, vice principal, that's your intended audience or your students. So it takes a little while for them to make that shift. And so the rubric thing is really something that they're used to, but yet we're shifting it on them.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think it's not fair. You've got many years of becoming proficient at using a rubric, and then you come into this master's program, and we go, rubrics changed. What are your
Well,
thoughts on that?
I'm thinking about, a simple question. All of this talk, all of this conversation makes me think of a simple question. And it's one or the other, really. It's what do I want my learners to memorize? Who do I want my learners to become? Who do my learners want to become themselves? So when I bring it to that, I can't ignore the authentic context that the students can really, use the less prescriptive rubric to help them achieve their goals. With that in mind, we're constantly thinking. I just got feedback this last week from a student who said, and this is the third course in the program, I've actually had an opportunity to work on something that's going to impact my organization in a big way. My work is meaningful to me. And she's not the only one, but it made me think, well, this gives me some great opportunities to give them feed forward. So kind of to take the conversation over to feed forward instead of just focusing on, yes, they memorized it. That's easy grading for me. That's easy for me to do. I can go down, yeah, they got it. Yeah, they know what the growth mindset is. Yeah. But I could also take the opportunity, and yes, it's a little bit more work on my part, but it's worth it if it's going to impact people in a big way. And for this person to understand and go through the change process in and of itself to get, here's where I started, here's where I want to be. And my professor came alongside me as a mentor, as a coach, as a facilitator, as a guide, and gave me feed forward that helped me think of things that would not only deepen my learning, but would cause me to make changes to a training program or something. That's something a rubric can't account for. Can you see on a rubric made large changes in an organization? Can that be a checkbox? Well, maybe, but what kind of changes? I mean, we have to make this real, and the best way to do this is to not put it in a preconceived checklist, because that tells me that as the teacher, you better pay attention to what I want you to know, because it's important to me. Whether it's important to you or not really doesn't matter. And that I'm building off of Roger Schenk's ideas in his book on cognitive sciences, cognitive minds. And that was so impactful for me because I'm now sitting in the seat of my students and what they're thinking, as they're making these changes and building these plans and communicating and engaging using media projects like you were talking about. That is something a rubric can't always account for.
Yeah, the rubrics can be useful, again, going back to information transfer, useful in that regard. But when you're talking about those impactful
Mm-hmm.
innovation plans that students are implementing, and when they recognize that they're going to actually make a significant change in their environment, yeah, it isn't easily measured by a checklist form. Um, Now we understand that, we see that, but how do we share? How do we encourage students to make that shift, to make that adjustment? Because to be fair to our learners when they're coming into our program, education is well renowned for having the rhetoric of Dewey, all student-centered learning, personalized learning. We talk the talk, but man, you have to write an ACT exam. There's standardized testing everywhere. Most students are used to regurgitating information on a test. Tell me what I need to write in the essay, and give me a template, and I'll follow the template. So it isn't often that students really get to take ownership of the learning. So what are your thoughts? How do we get them to start to make that shift in ownership so they start to recognize things like the rubric that they're used to isn't going to help them, but the feedback that we give them in terms of encouraging them to make improvements, the feedback that we give students, helping them to recognize that they're becoming a digital leader, and that's what we're helping them become. How do we help them to make that adjustment, do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I think having these conversations is helpful, but I also think that if you ask the students, particularly in a class, or if you're connecting with them one-on-one, think back to a time when learning was important to you, or when you learned something that was significant enough to impact your life. I can guarantee that every single person in that room or in that meeting that you're having is not going to say, well, I remember this test in my third grade year, that really helped me, push the envelope. It's not going to come from there. For me, in our COVA ebook that's available on your site, the biggest moment I remember learning was the Goodness Goldberg cracking those eggs in sixth grade when we had to design that machine where that egg started at the top, uncharted, just all kinds of materials, drop that egg in there, and then it had to go all the way to the bottom without cracking that egg. I remember building, connecting, collaborating, building a plan, and then sharing this, describing it, had to pick a name. We had to own this. We had to own this. We didn't own this. We didn't really learn it. I guess I could have read about it and had to regurgitate a multiple choice, which happened a lot, a multiple choice question on a test. But I don't remember that. If that happened, I don't remember. What I remember is learning by doing. And I think about Hattie's work and, some of those that have been advocating this. But like you said, we walk the talk of Dewey. And we don't actually do it. So.
Yeah, you've mentioned something that is, I think, really significant, and this is something that we keep on coming back to. Another topic for another one of our sessions about ownership. And you'd mentioned with the Rube Goldberg, whatever, the cracking the egg thing you and your classmates did in sixth grade, you owned it. Mm-hmm. And with rubrics, the teacher owns it.
Yeah.
And it isn't the learner. Right? Rubric is one more of a teacher-centered perspective because this is the teacher's checklist. So the rubrics that we use in the DLL program, for example, we still use them, but we don't own them, and they're vague and they're open because the learner owns the project. The learner owns the innovation plan. And
what we're trying to trouble. If they don't take that ownership, then what happens is that rubric, it becomes a big complaint, and it's tough. It's a bit of a mindset shift, and it's one that, if we really want to invest, and I tell folks early on, invest in yourself and do these things, to help you understand and make that transition in your thinking. So when you're building a learning manifesto or you're building your learning philosophy, think about you. What are your thoughts? What do you think? I cannot prescribe your thoughts in a checklist. I cannot prescribe your next steps, or your actions, or as a future administrator, what you're going to do. I tell folks the superintendent is not going to hand you a list of this is what you need to do to transform your campus. You need to own that and walk the walk, right? And if you don't, it's going to fall on you, and it's not going to actually happen or occur. And you're not going to influence folks if you don't take ownership. So us changing the rubrics this way and kind of making it open is to allow for them to take ownership of those ideas. It's uncomfortable. It's not always easy to do. People will say, well, I want to institute or try this blended learning model, but what do I do? How do I do COVA? And I'm like, you don't actually do COVA. You actually immerse your students in it by giving them opportunities for a little bit of freedom to and control to think on their own 2 feet. That's real world skills. Those are real world skills, and we can't rob our learners, even as adults or kids, of those opportunities. That's not to say every single opportunity and learning opportunity needs to be that way, but we do need to allow for those opportunities to happen, for real learning to occur. That makes sense?
Yeah, I think we really do. You had mentioned something that I think is really important, and that is real learning is dependent upon those opportunities, but you also mentioned that it takes time. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that always astonishes me, I had the privilege, and I say this is a privilege, of working with the students in the graduating class, the capstone class, the synthesis or the 5320 class in our DLL program. And it's a privilege because I get to read about their reflection looking back on the program. And one of the most consistent themes that comes out is that students consistently say that I wish I would have taken ownership sooner. Mm-hmm. I wish I would have just realized that this was mine. And then once I took that full ownership, I was nudging around the edges at first. And sometimes it can take 2 or 3 courses for a student to get to that point. But we see that. We see that with the students, those who embrace their innovation plan and go for it. Once they're committed, once they're committed, it changes how things work. The issue of the rubric not being specific enough goes away because, if anything, their
Right.
project is theirs. And the feedback that we give them is not about checking things off a list. The feedback that we give them is about helping them to be successful in implementing their innovation plan. And once they recognize that our goal as instructors is to come alongside as facilitators and to encourage them to continue to build on those wonderful ideas that they have in that foundation. Once they go down that path, it changes the whole perspective. And there are some students who get it by actually maybe even the first course or the third course. But I'm seeing it's usually kind of the middle, the
Yeah.
05, 04 is where it really, or 13, it starts to take effect. And so that's if there's one regret the students have, they always say, I wish I would have bought in and taken ownership sooner.
Yeah.
And have you seen the same thing, or is it just my delusionally optimistic perspective?
It's a little scary. And I had a student email me, and we're kind of getting into the program here and talking a little bit about that, but real world examples, right?
Yeah.
So one student emailed me and said, you know, I've been a little fearful, but I'm not worried about my grade because I am feeling comfortable enough. So they're not focused on grades, that I can actually make some decisions, test some things out, experiment these things, and see how they're going to impact what I'm doing in my current role and my institution, my organization. And I'm not worried about the grade right now. Like the mindset shifted. I'm worried about my organization. I'm worried about making these changes. So when the shift focus, we're not saying don't worry about, marking, grade, all of that. What we're saying is we can see it. We can see the transition occur when you're focused and you take an ownership kind of, on what you're doing, or if you're doing something kind of just to pass and get through those check marks. So it's important to, for our students to remember, but us too. If we're not teaching courses and actually preparing and looking through and making sure our students are, well taken care of and we're responding with them, it shows. So we want to be sure, that we're modeling and encouraging our students to make those decisions, test and try some things, experiment, and just take control and some ownership over what they're doing, because ultimately it's their world, it's their life, and they want to make, they've got these innovative ideas and the changes they want to make, and we want to encourage them to do so. But you can't always hide behind fear a little bit. You know what I'm saying? So you got to take that step out there and jump. I mean, what did Peter Diamandis say? Innovation, ideas come from nonsense. Failure is the engine for innovation. Those are the last two chapters of the book. I think about some of these things that our students are fearful. Well, without a rubric, I could fail. Well, actually, if you don't do anything, you're going to fail. But if you actually get out there and take the step and have a little bit of an entrepreneurial edge and just take a little bit of a risk, we're going to help you and we're going to support you. We're not going to punish you for that. And I think that's sometimes where the disconnect is.
Well, you're addressing an interesting point that I think some people might have some difficulty with. Well, listen, learning, it's about getting it right, isn't it? Don't we have to assess students to a standard and make sure they meet that standard? You're
Yeah.
talking about letting, fail and repeated failure. Wasn't that going to be discouraging? Everything that you talked about comes from a notion of failing forward, which is a foreign idea for a lot of people because we live in a world of standards, and the best answer is the right answer that you give to your professor or you submit in the exam. But what you're talking about is authentic learning, where you build something, and as you're building it, you start to recognize, wow, that's not going to work. Another example. I had a student. This is also something else that's amazing with the graduating class, and this is so common. A lot of students find out I had this amazing, grandiose plan at the beginning, and I started to build it. I built an implementation strategy, and all these things are starting to happen, and I started to implement it, and I recognized it didn't work
Mm-hmm.
because I made a fundamental error. I actually didn't ask my audience what they needed. I didn't take a look at what really was needed. I built it and they didn't come. And so we find that students have to make that pivoting. But that
Good point.
exercise, that pivot, that shift, recognizing, that didn't work, I need to make an adjustment, was probably one of the most significant learning experiences for this particular student that I just, he was talking about that in his reflection, that it changed everything because he recognized, wow, I was talking the talk of doing all these things, but yet I was controlling every single dynamic, and I wasn't getting the other learners involved, my students and the
Yeah.
other teachers, and so on and so forth. And so, there's nothing like a real world project to insert a little bit of reality into your dreams of your innovation plan. But guess what? That's the real world. And the exciting part about, preparing students and encouraging them, supporting them by giving them strategies to deal with those frustrations. It's frustrating. It's annoying. It's aggravating to have to redo stuff. But when they know they can do it and they're not
Mhm.
penalized for that and they can actually make those adjustments, move ideas forward, changes everything. It's
Yeah.
theirs. And when they make that pivot, when they make that adjustment, it's easy because guess what? They're comfortable with the idea of multiple iterations,
Yeah.
multiple edits. It's no more right or wrong. No, it's really, well, how well have you developed it to this point? It's different, isn't it? It's different. So rubrics really fall short in an authentic learning environment because they limit things. It's a checklist, yes or no. And because real world projects have an aspect of unpredictability, they have an aspect of change, they have an aspect of, they have a necessity of flexibility. You have to build that in. And you can do that with outcomes. You can do that with outcomes. And so, some people will say, well, where do you look to what you need to do for the assignment? The assignment outcomes, the assignment instructions. That's another thing that I think we need to address is that what I'm noticing is that a lot of students will not bother to read the assignment instructions and they look to the rubric as to what I need to do. And so there's a tendency for students to overlook the assignment requirements because they've been conditioned to see the rubric as what they need to do as opposed to the instructions. Are you seeing any of that?
Yeah. Actually, I have noticed that quite a bit. But as that perspective and mindset kind of shifts into the ownership, I get less and less and less and less rubric questions. You know, I don't want folks to think that, if they can check everything off and the rubric's my backup tool. If I know that I've passed everything on the rubric, I'm gonna pass me well. Well, authentic learning doesn't actually. I've never seen someone come up with a rubric on if they're going to implement a campus initiative, because there's so many tweaks and adjustments you have to make room for. You have to almost live in the moment. You have to be flexible enough to make those tweaks and adaptations. I don't know that I could find that anywhere in a rubric per se, but at the same time, I think it's good to keep it. Okay, so let me give you another example. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about this when you were talking before I get away from this idea. As a classroom teacher, and I've spent many years in the classroom, it's so easy for us classroom teachers to, okay, we ask a question, the kids raise their hand, and we're looking for that right answer. Why? Everyone heard it. Now we can move on. Right? That to me is like an informal checklist. I'm just kind of informally checking to see if my students know or don't know. But what that tells me that one student knows that one thing, whether they read it or I told it to them. Either way, it's something important, and I felt I needed to question my students. But what's really helpful, and I've noticed education kind of shifting in this direction a little bit, is when you have 24 students in your class and you have 15 people that have their hand raised. You write down all of these ideas, or have these students write down their ideas and share them on their whiteboard, and take bits and pieces of that and talk a bit about why each one of those could contribute to maybe a different way to get to that answer, or maybe a different answer. It's not necessarily just, there's one answer and that's it. So that, from going from that informal checklist to encompassing many ideas and seeing that there's multiple ways to solve problems. And an open rubric in an authentic learning environment would allow that. There's multiple ways to do the same thing, but your interpretation and my interpretation, based on our experience and based on our districts and our contexts and our learning environments and whatever we're going after, is going to look different. So we can't box our students into a corner and say, okay, you at the Virtual Learning Academy, you as a network engineer, you as a special ed teacher, all have to say the exact same thing. Y'all have to do this innovation if you check this off, the innovation will have happened. Well, no, that's not how it works. It has to be open enough to allow for, like, that classroom experience, different perspectives, and the audience. What are they wanting to know? What do they need to know? What do you need to know? And then that's where you got to go back to those outcomes, and that goes back to the bigger picture perspective. That bigger, broader picture. We have to always look at that and see how all the pieces kind of fit.
Yeah, the bigger, broader perspective. Again, yeah, I have to remind myself that a day after the capstone course finishes might not be the best day to do these videos, because this is I've been reading everything about what my students have been talking about. Another exciting thing that I read from the students that are graduating the program is that they appreciate the why. They appreciate the fact that the why is significantly important. They have an opportunity to change lives one student at a time. And the why that we have in the DLL program is significant, that idea of changing lives. And they're recognizing that they can contribute to changing lives, and it's really important. The why, in terms of setting up an environment, whether it's a blended learning environment, a makerspace, or the e-portfolios, the why becomes even more significant. The other thing that the students have mentioned is that they connect the why and the big, hairy, audacious goal from our course on creating significant learning environments. So they see this idea of the why being revisited in a variety of other places, and that why is so important. And once we really accept the fact that people don't buy what you do, it's why you do it. And they really recognize that we are a whole being. We've got the affective domain. We're emotional. We respond emotionally. We think cognitively. We interact with our hands. There's the whole. When you look at Bloom's taxonomy, it's a whole individual. It isn't just the head. It isn't just that cognitive domain. It's the psychomotor, the affective. It's all those pieces. And the why is that amazing mechanism that helps bring things together. And it's something you keep on coming back to all the time. You mentioned at the beginning, and it's so important. And when I see the students, the capstone course, again, another big theme. Once I really got to handle the why, everything else fit. Yeah, it's really important.
I've noticed that when I ask them initially in the beginning of our program what they think is the most important, the why, the how, or the what, a lot of them emphasize the how. Lots and lots. The how is the most important. But by the time they get to 5313 or 04, when they start taking a look at that, and then move down the program into the final capstone course, that's changed. It's no longer just, and hardly anyone picks the what, but it's that how, the piece that switches over to the why. Okay, so if my people on my campus understand why I'm doing what I'm doing, and they're willing to be part of that, I'm focusing on them as an individual and not just getting my innovation plan out there, but I'm thinking about their needs too, and that why becomes everyone's why. They really influence their campuses in a huge way. But until they make that shift in ownership to the why, then it comes out. It's like, wow, where have you been?
Yeah, the why is so important. Well, I think we've really covered a lot of interesting ideas with a rubric. Just want to, I think we are almost at the point where we can wrap up. I just want to sort of reiterate something you said. We're not against rubrics in the right context. If you have to prepare somebody for a credentialing exam, there's a standardized test. Yeah, rubrics will work. They will. It's a tool. It's one of many tools, but it's not the Swiss Army knife of assessment tools. It's not. You need to use the right tool in the right place. And so rubrics can be used in the right context. But with authentic learning, it's really about who do you want that learner to become, right? As opposed to what information do you want them to give you. And that goes back to the why. And why are you doing that? Why do you want to change the world one student at a time? Well, guess what? Don't we want a better world? Why? Why not? I think that's
a little bit delusionally optimistic here.
I know it's the glass half full all the time. I don't think my cup is never empty. It's always a pleasure to talk about these ideas, and hopefully our listeners and our viewers will find these insights useful. Looking forward to receiving some comments on that. I think we've covered most things. Is there anything you wanted to maybe wrap up with?
I'm looking forward to our next conversation. I think we opened up a lot of things in this one that we will be able to talk about. So,
Yeah, that list is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So what do you think is going to be next? The ownership issue or
I was kind of thinking about yeah, well, we kind of talked quite a bit more than I expected to about rubrics and authentic learning. So, yeah, maybe the ownership would be a good one to
okay.
tackle next.
Well, listen, we're going to sign off now. I think we've addressed the issue of rubrics, when, how you use them, what they might look like, when you might not use them, and what are some alternatives. So hopefully everyone finds this useful. Signing off. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.